Richard Sakwa is Professor Emeritus of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent at Canterbury, a Senior Research Fellow at the National Research University, Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and an Honorary Professor in the Faculty of Political Science at Moscow State University. After graduating in history from the London School of Economics, he took a PhD from the Center for Russian and East European Studies at the University of Birmingham. He held lectureships at the Universities of Essex and California, Santa Cruz, before joining the University of Kent in 1987. He has published widely on Soviet, Russian, post-communist, and international affairs. Recent books include Putin Redux, Power and Contradiction in Contemporary Russia. That's from London and New York publishers, Routledge, 2014. Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands. That's published by Taurus, 2016. Russia Against the Rest, The Post-Cold War Crisis of World Order, Cambridge University Press, 2017. And Russia's Futures, Cambridge Polity, 2019. His book, The Putin Paradox, was published by Ivy Torres, Bloomsbury in 2020, and his Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War came out with Lexington Books in late 2021. His latest book is The Lost Peace, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War, Yale University Press. So with further ado, I welcome Professor Sakwa.
Thank you. It's lovely to be back here. This is my third time speaking to UNA in Harpenden, and I'm delighted to see you all again. So this talk it's got a very long title, as you've heard, East-West European Conflict, Historical Prejudices, and Relevance in a Multipolar World. So I apologize in advance if the talk is perhaps a little bit disconnected or disjointed, I think is the word. Okay. Okay, so so because I never like to give the same talk twice, and so I always fiddling about and changing it and swapping bits and so on. So every single audience is, as it were, guinea pigs in which I test out thoughts and ideas. So and today you're going to be we're all going to be particularly experimental. So I'm trying out some new thoughts or new ways, because what I've always felt my task is, and I very much look forward to that, or you look forward to the talk in November. It looks like it's continuing these themes. Is how can we make sense of developments in international affairs today? So not just from a historical perspective, but from the perspective of political thought, political philosophy in general. So how can we make sense of it amidst the swirling tides of opinion and increasingly bad-tempered public discourse in which clearly we now live, where attention span is very short, and the shorter the attention span, the more intense the abuse and the failure to achieve genuine dialogue. So that's the context of what I want to say. So my talk is going to be in a number of sections. And the first section is some larger thoughts. Where does it all work? Because the question is, in general, clearly the issue is we're facing a whole stack of what Wolfgang Street calls a polycrisis. It's a crisis of institutions. It's a crisis of belief in government, a crisis in belief in the sense that any type of progressive politics activity can achieve anything, any public goods, any public development, and so on. So that's the context. And of course, so I'll just mention the book, The Lost Peace, is very much specifically about how we squandered the opportunity at the end of the first Cold War in 1989-91 to build what I call a positive peace order, based precisely on the UN Charter of 1945, which is very much, in my view, very much the legal normative foundation for politics today. I'll go back to that. So in other words, we've entered, instead of the positive peace, which I believe was potential in 1945 and again in 1989, we squandered it, and we now find ourselves in a more difficult position even than we did in 1945 or 1989 at the end or during the First Cold War. So it's far deeper, far more profound difficulties. How can we achieve a vision of a positive peace order? And it's not abstract, it's not idealist, it's very, very firmly rooted in necessity, historical necessity. So we've got we've reaped a very bitter harvest of these failures, and so that's what I'm trying to deal with and make sense of today. So I could say the context, and it's still my opening talk of opening concept, the framework is, I will argue that we are living amidst a, if you like, two major cycles of politics, two intersecting, you can say maybe even two major intersecting cycles, and a number of concepts within that. So the first cycle is a small one and a long one. The smaller one is the cycle begun after 1945. So what I now argue very strongly is the unity of that whole period, based because in 1945 an international system was established based on the United Nations, based on the Charter, and of course the whole body of international law and norms and so on, which developed on its basis. So that whole period, unfortunately, that post-1945 also intersected, was based on one sense, the potential for that positive peace based on the UN Charter and all of it. It's not, as I said, the United Nations Charter is not an abstract document. It's emerged out of learning from the failures of the Versailles Peace in 1919. It's also built on the achievements and failures, if you like, of the Congress of Vienna, Balance of Power, 1815, Treaty of Utrecht in 1714, which introduced diplomacy and basically, and of course, the foundation for modern politics, which is Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 at the end of the 30 Years' War. So in other words, that moment in 1945 was it's not the culmination, or the culmination of that particular development of how should states interact with each other. And the fundamental idea at the basis of that system was sovereign internationalism. In other words, that states need to look after their national interest, their national development, and indeed associated with concepts of good leadership. And, I define a good leader as someone who leaves their country more happy, more prosperous, more developed than when they came to power. And, with all these concepts of a positive peace order. And so this was a culmination of a lot of thinking. You may say it's a Western element, yes, but the UN Charter had China and the Soviet Union and the Arab world involved as well. So it was becoming universalization, not just the European system. So but of course, 1945, we had at exactly the same time, Hiroshima, the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 was not only the last act of World War II, it was the first act of this new type of international politics, this nuclear age, and in which it inaugurated the Cold War. And a Cold War is a great power conflict, and I'll come back to that if time, that no side wishes or can fight without turning destruction upon themselves. And so this phase of 1945 to today is a whole historical epoch, which is everything we talk about, and all the politics which conduct in it is within that framework of that international system. Several phases: Cold War I from 45 or 47 to 1989, then Cold Peace for 25 years, 1989 to 2014, in which none of the fundamental questions of international politics was resolved. A catastrophic failure. This is as I say, the squandering of the opportunity of a more positive peace, because the end of the Soviet Union, end of ideological conflict of communism, capitalism, and so on. And then, of course, from 2014, second Cold War, which is the Second Cold War, which we're now well into it, is fought and conducted much higher up the foothills of the Third World War than the First Cold War. That's why the Second Cold War, which we're now involved in, is far more dangerous, far more pervasive, far more pernicious than that First Cold War, and it's going to be far harder to get out of. I have no idea. We can discuss that ways forwards. So that each of these phases has a distinctive character, but so that's the short cycle we're living in. There's also a longer cycle, and that's a longer cycle, which I don't think we can understand the short cycle unless we begin to think about the meaning of this second cycle. And the second cycle is about 500 years long. And if this short cycle is characterized by the emergence of what I will discuss in a minute, a political West, the Atlantic power system, NATO, European Union, and so on. In particular, the dominance of this power system, US-based, and so on. This longer cycle is focused on the emergence of a civilizational West, not a political West, that's a particular form, but a civilizational West for 500 years, which you could say began in 1492 when Columbus, the Europeans stumbled upon the New World. I wouldn't say discovered it because it was there long before, but nevertheless they discovered it for Europe. So this is the civilizational West. Why do I mention this? It's important because it's a type of vision of modernity. So it emerges what it is to be modern, what is the relationship between the individual and society, what is the role of religion in all of this, what are the spiritual and other cultural values of a society. They have been forged over 500 years. And why I'm emphasizing this today is because this crisis, which I can call Cold War, but it's far bigger than that. Cold War doesn't cover everything that's going on at the moment. It's the intersection of this crisis, of this political West, and of this cycle after 1945, and the crisis of this larger cycle, if you like, and this to bring in perhaps spirituality and all sorts of other aspects and cultural factors which are fundamental to the character of understanding international affairs today. So there's all sorts of economic and other dimensions to that. So we could talk about the rise and fall of the civilizational West. And it's got two aspects to it. The civilizational West is 500-year story, which has a geopolitical factor, which of course is the dominant of Western powers. This is initially Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, England, and so on. And of course today, United States. But we're talking about colonies, we're talking about empires, and the global dominance of Western powers. It's important because today, what is this? Our culture is permeated with discussions not just of post-colonialism, but of decoloniality. And the difference is, decoloniality is an attempt to examine the deeper colonial and imperial and geopolitical visions which have dominated the Western state system for the last 500 years. And that's a fundamental point, that geopolitics, and even why should, for example, the United States feel that it has to remain number one state, that it has to stop and block any other state emerging. It's not just a cycle of a reflection of the cycle since 1945, when the United States emerged out of the Second World War as 50% of global GDP, a colossus across the world. Still, the United States still is the more powerful, just simply in military spending terms, than the 10 next states going down. But why should it feel that it has to maintain its dominance, its primacy, hegemony, call it what you like, and so on. And so that's a deeper Western vision of modernity, which as I shall try to examine later, is challenged fundamentally. And of course, it also has an economic dimension, this long cycle, which is endless debates about the relationship between empire and domestic development. And of course, endless interesting and fascinating discussions about, it's not just post-colonial, decolonial world, it's also about the nature of empire. And so we see the world of empires, even though colonies have gone, but still there's neo-colonialism in Africa, even today. These big cycles, for example, you look at Mali, you look at Gabon, you look at Cameroon, you look at Central African Republic. Finally, the debate in those countries, in Angola, even interestingly, what the debate today, let alone in India, the debate today is, how can we deal with this modernity which was imposed on us in the colonial epoch, and now, as you know, all these countries are saying, no, we don't want to go with Atlantic powers, with France, the old colonist, Britain, or the United States. And they're looking to China with the Belt and Road Initiative and moving in a different sort of way. So it's economic, of course, endless debates. I won't mention all, J.H. Hobson, Hilferding, Lenin, and Karl Kautsky. But interesting, just as some of you may have encountered Karl Kautsky, who was the leader of German social democracy at the end of the 19th century and into the First World War. And he came up with this notion of ultra-imperialism, because Lenin and others said, these imperial powers, Germany and the United Kingdom, their conflict led to the First World War, inter-imperialist war. Kautsky said, no, what will happen with these major Western powers is they will establish a cartel. They'll work together. And that, of course, is precisely what many people now argue is what the European Union was and what this Atlantic power system, or the West, as we call it, since 1945. That's why I'm talking in those terms. And so it's a bit disjointed. All these themes need hours of development, but I just thought I'd lay it out there because I think it's important to give this larger context. In other words, to make sense of it, we have to examine not just a state system, but the nature of all of it. I could say a bit more about that, but I'll just now go to my second section and look more, that's a big picture, if you like, more specifically on this, the East-West conflict before going to the European dimension of it. So, as I mentioned, we live, there are two things I want to say. That there's an international system, which I've said is today, the international system established in 1945, the UN Charter at its foundation. And this provides an epoch with its framework for the conduct of international affairs. So, as you know now with Gaza, Ukraine, Taiwan, and so on, all these crises, everybody's all the time appealing to the United Nations, to international law, and quite rightly so, because it provides, no one is saying that there is world government. There is not, definitely not. And in fact, but everybody accepts, except two major countries, Israel and Ukraine, accepts the new normative dominance of that legal normative framework of the UN system. Israel repudiates it over and over again explicitly. It has nothing to do with us. We have a higher mission to build the Jewish state, the Israeli state. There's a whole debate about that. And Israel says UN has failed us and we don't want anything to do with it and so on. We'll use it when we can, but they quite explicitly repudiate the Charter international system. I've got quotations which say that the leaders do so. Except when it's useful. So it's the Charter international system is the framework of international politics today. Then we have at another level international politics, and this is where the news and everything reflects the day-to-day events, the international politics, and within international politics you have constellations of powers. And of course, you have today 200 states, 193 states in the United Nations. And it was the United Nations system which provided the framework for decolonization, for the emergence of this state system today of sovereign independent states. So we have this international system, and then within them, international politics is conducted to integrate powers and constellations. And in international politics, we have a number of visions of world order. So we used to have the Soviet vision of world order, communism, international communism, so on. That collapsed in 1989-91, leaving only one major vision of world order standing. That is that world order associated with the political West. US dominated, yet encompassing some the states of Western Europe, Canada, and allies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, and some others. The emergence of a political West. So we have this international system, within it an order, the political West. The danger is that this political West is claiming privileges and powers that should belong properly to the UN system, to the international system. So what we've seen in 1945 is an uncomfortable relationship between the world order represented by the political West and that larger global universal system represented by the UN Charter International System. This tension is fundamental. Today, or earlier, the political West called itself many different things. It called it national order. Today, for the last decade or so, it has called itself the rules-based international order, which of course, by definition, means who makes the rules? Why does the political West claim to be a rules-based international order when it doesn't need the rules are there in the UN system and in the Charter and so on? So the rules-based international order quite explicitly is a way of making the political West independent of the obligation to observe the procedures and institutions and rules of the UN system. So in other words, we have a substitution going on. It was there in this first Cold War, it was not so bad because it was balanced by the Soviet Union and indeed emerging China and the so-called Third World and the non-aligned movement. And they all said to Washington and London and so on, that you've got to stick to the UN Charter. Of course, it was all very debated, but it worked. After 1989, and when we got to multipolarity, we got to a world of unipolarity, where the United States was the last man standing, effectively. It then claimed to substitute. And so, in other words, this in the way that the political West works, it isn't accidental that there are double standards. It is a systemic feature of how the political West nowadays works, that it sometimes will apply UN Charter principles and sometimes will not. So the political West is in danger of substituting it. I mean, I can say much more about the political West. I can just say that after 1989, it became far more radical. In fact, another work I'm working on now is actually called the revolutionary West, because it's claiming global dominance, both intellectual, rooting not just in post-Cold War and post-1945, but 500-year long ambition and indeed energy and vitality to dominate the world. And of course, it's doing so. So after 1989, as the only world order left, we got to a unipolar system in which the rules of the United Nations were used when they were useful and abused when they were not. And ignored, and so on. And this is endless debates about that. John Mearsheimer talks about liberal hegemony. We've talked about that in this room before. So, but the thing about, I mean, I could say many things about the political West, but one of them is that it undermines the principle of sovereign internationalism. And its fundamental dominating principle is democratic internationalism. That sounds good. And we all want democracy, we all want human rights and so on. Unfortunately, it is not democratic internationalism in a genuine sense. It is democratic internationalism allows the political West to claim the right to interfere and intervene in the internal affairs of other states when and how it wants to, in the name of the higher good, which is democracy. Unfortunately, democracy in that framework is no longer genuinely the expression of popular sovereignty. It becomes democratism. Democratism is the view that there is a higher purpose to democracy than the simple expression of the popular will. The debates, let's give an example. The debate today, coming up soon, well, this weekend is Moldova, but I'll leave that in Georgia in a couple of weeks. In Georgia, the Republic of Georgia in the South Caucasus. And it's one of the signal examples of a battle going on today, where democracy is fighting Western-backed democratism. In Georgia, it's a small country, less, I think, about 3 million population. But in that country, there are over 30,000 Western-funded NGOs, non-governmental organizations. It's extraordinary, mostly funded out of Washington, some in London and some others, but it is just extraordinary density. So you have a whole network of younger people, energy, who get their money from outside the National Endowment for Democracy, which of course was established in 1980s by Reagan, explicitly. The founder, Carl Gershwin, said explicitly what the CIA used to do by intervening and regime change and coups and all of that sort of stuff, we now do through using democracy as an instrument of undermining any states that is against or not aligning with the United States. It's quite explicit. National Endowment for Democracy, headed by Carl Gershwin. His quote, it's a famous quotation, and that's what they're doing. And so in Georgia today, the big question is, this election, it's a fateful election where, it's in the context of a divided great power conflict, Russia, China, United States, and the Western powers, the European powers, who's going to decide the fate of Georgia? So it's a fascinating election coming up, and all the debates associated with it. The view that perhaps Georgians want to remain non-aligned. Maybe they don't want to become, there's obviously joining the European Union is a fairly neutral thing, but they don't want to join NATO and join the military alliance system. In fact, as far as I know, the younger people, NGO world wants to, because that's their interest, but the majority don't. But if, for example, the Georgian Green Party, which is the dominant one at the moment, wins, and their view is that they want to remain non-aligned, they want to have good relations with China, with Russia, and the United States, and the European Union, not to have to choose to become simply a pawn in all of these conflicts. So anyway, that's interesting, that's what I mean by democratism. So that is the political West radicalized in all sorts of ways after 1989. However, today we see the emergence, and this is where the multipolar side comes in from powerfully, we see the emergence of, it's not quite clear what we can call it, but just simply by analogy, if we have a political West established after 1945, a political West which has its economic and political features and a whole set of hierarchy within it, and of course, one of the key features of the political West is not just democratism, but it's militarism, because it was forged by the first Cold War and with NATO as a defense body and so on. And this was not dismantled at the end of the first Cold War, 1989, and it was perpetuated. And then today it's actually in full flood, developing. And also the point about this political West, that it isn't just an external foreign policy issue. It actually changes the character of a state itself within that system. There's excellent work about the way the European Union changes the states as its members. Christopher Bickerton at Cambridge has done a book, and my colleague Phil Cunliffe from Kent, who's now at UCL, who have written about the concept of a member state. It changes the character of a state, for good or ill. I'm not making a particularly point about that. But also, membership of the Atlantic power system, the political life, changes the character of a state as well. That has been neglected in the literature. In the United States, it has meant the enormous power of the military industrial propaganda think tank state. And indeed, it's affected the whole public discourse. It's amazing. Almost every single US congressional district, 435 of them, has a major military plant in it. And the military industrial complex, are funding the Atlantic Council, funding Chatham House, funding that vast network, which shapes the way we think, it shapes the media, and it shapes public discourse. This is what happened. This Cold War mentality. And you remember that communist Dwight D. Eisenhower, when he resigned or left power, and his farewell speech in 1961, where he condemned the power of the military-industrial complex. It has become even more dominant in the US since then. And those institutions of democracy, if you can say the Trumanite state, forged in the Cold War against the institutions by James Madison, the Congress, Constitution, law, and so on, are subordinated to it. So we have, and that's what's happened in the West, the political West entirety, every state, there's security state, to the point at which, for example, our dear leader today in the UK, Keir Starmer, said when we were on we had a Stop the War Coalition meeting, and Keir Starmer at that time, just before, not long before the election, explicitly said, opposition to NATO is incompatible with Labour Party membership. That was Keir Starmer. And that was an example for me of how the state is transformed, that he forgets that the Labour Party was always a movement as much as a party. A movement of peaceniks, a movement of CND, of religious, of Quakers, of pacifists, of people committed to the United Nations. All of that has been swept aside in this transformation of that party. And of course, anybody who stands against it is expelled. At a meeting in Whitstable, which is not far from Canterbury, not long ago, and it was the start of the Labour Party club. And it was astonishing. About 60 people were there. About half of them had been expelled from the Labour Party over the last year. Absolutely astonishing, including Betty, who was a famous figure locally, 84 years old, 60 years in the Labour Party, and expelled a few months ago for talking for peace, a peacenik. So this is the way this political West changes. We have emerging on the other side I don't know what to call it, a political East. Let's call it that for convenience. And this political East is emerging, and there's a loose alignment, and it is not a simple anti-Western voting. That's foolish. That's a dead end. It is counter-West. It is countering the logic of what the West has become, and it's going to become even far worse. And it's a counter-hegemonic, counter-West, it's post-Western, if you like, even as well. So what is this political East? It's very nebulous. It's just beginning to take shape, but it exists. It's obviously, at its core, we have a Russo-Chinese alignment, obviously much denigrated today, but at its core, you have a number of institutions, plus, of course, many states from what is today called the Global South, or the global majority, which are not just swing states, but there's plenty there who insist they don't want to choose. They don't want to either bandwagon with Moscow, Beijing, or Washington, or London, or Brussels, or anybody else. They want to enjoy their sovereign international. They want to engage internationally in trade, culture, economics, and so on, but also to retain their national sovereignty without becoming vassals or whatever. So this political East isn't just a number of institutions, but it is that as well. But it's a vision of post-bloc politics. And in other words, it appeals constantly to the UN Charter and to the vision of a positive peace embedded in that UN-based system. So, and this is why what Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union appealed to when he put an end to the Cold War earlier, and others as well, plenty of others in India, the non-aligned movement in the Balkans, and so on. And of course, this political East has a number of institutions. Next week, for example, the BRICS grouping will be meeting with Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. 4 new members joined earlier this year. That is Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and United Arab Republics. Saudi Arabia hasn't left, but it has deferred its membership. About 30 or 40 countries have applied to join BRICS Plus. That includes Turkey, Indonesia, and plenty of others. This is a game changer. So the conference will be meeting next week, the summit in Kazan in Russia. And it's a major event, It's also another body which is post-Western. It's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And of course, there's lots of development bodies associated with the Belt and Road the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's relatively small. It invests about $4 billion a year today, though with best practice involved environmental and other elements when it invests. Compared, the World Bank invests about 100 billion a year, so still it's relatively small, but it's important. With the emergence of a post-Western, explicitly post-Western, but I repeat, not anti-Western, and that's very important because, and the point about this political East is that it appeals to the, it fails just as much as the political West often to the principles of the UN Charter, but it certainly appeals and says this rules-based order, it's against that usurpation of that. The charter system today is under greater threat than it has been since 1945. So this whole, and if it goes, this UN-based system, and it's then we really are in literally uncharted waters. But it is being challenged by everything. Endless debate about UN reform. I won't go into that. Of course, with that, everybody accepts that India should join, and then maybe rotating membership from Africa. African Union will decide, and the latest thinking is that the African Union will choose amongst themselves. There's 54 countries in Africa, and that they will choose one each year to become a permanent member, well, a member of the UN Security Council with veto powers, rather than choosing Nigeria, Egypt, or South Africa, or any of the major countries to be the permanent representative. The United States and the West, of course, what does it want? It wants Japan and it wants Germany in, which is pointless. Yet again, more Western power, more countries from the political West. So it's a total bankruptcy in the sense of doing it. In fact, the United States, Blinken just recently talked about the list who should join it, failed to mention India, and just vaguely talked about Africa. So it's unprecedented threats. I mean, I could go into detail about that, but one of the symptoms of this substitution is that the United Kingdom in particular has been pernicious in privatizing the UN Secretariat. So that's an important body which sets the agenda, allows what works, and at the moment it has been literally taken over by the Western powers, and they manipulate, I mean, insofar as they can, the agenda, and indeed the agenda for the UN General Assembly as well. And so enormous amount of anger generated in the global south today, the way that this has now been working. But that's a whole discussion about that. I just want to say a few words about the culture, because talking about prejudices and so on. I want to talk just briefly about the culture of the Cold War, and that's the long version. So I'll give the short version, because I know that I'm going to stop in a minute. So Cold War, we're in a second Cold War, and there's a distinctive culture associated with it. It's in fact, cultures. And what is this culture which now pervades our thinking and so on? It's just briefly, militarism. The mere fact that NATO survived after the end of the First Cold War is a sign that this, by definition, NATO is not a collective security body. It is a collective defense body. It's a fundamental difference. And it never managed to transform itself after 1989 into a collective security body. It remained a collective defense, and there's good reasons for it. Quite understand, and I understand why some Eastern European countries wanted to be part of that collective defense. But as long as it remained a collective defense body, it was always against someone. Whereas if it had become a collective security body, it would have been more inclusive. It would then have included Russia, which as Putin wanted to join, as you know, earlier on. It would then certainly be able to defuse the crisis with, it wouldn't have been a border with China. And so it failed to do so. So in other words, NATO then perpetuated the logic of Cold War and helped provide where we are today. And bloc politics. As you know, Chinese thinking absolutely denigrates and refuses. Even Russo-China relations, it is not an alliance. And in Beijing, they constantly say, no, we oppose bloc thinking. In other words, they want sovereign nation states defending their interests within that framework of sovereign internationalism. Another element is, and I'm going to use this word, closedness or hermeticism. It's, in other words, this political West has hyper-normalized its own modernity. That's why I talk about that 500-year cycle of civilization and modernity for the last 500 years. It's hyper-normalized it. By that I mean, anything which is outside of it is then become and considered abnormal, deviant, and indeed evil, and to be undermined and attacked and not respected. So it's a very powerful development in which the cycle, the small cycle, is amplifying themes of the long cycle of 500 years. We're unable to get beyond. This hypernormalization is important. And, you know, I'm sorry, on a wet Saturday morning to mention the term, but it's also a symptom of a feature of Gnosticism, I'm sorry to mention Gnosticism, G-N-O-S, the Gnostic thinking, which is again one of those pervasive thinking. You could even say Cold Wars are Gnostic Cold Wars. What does Gnostic Gnosis mean? It means that you believe that you have access to a special reality, a special fount of knowledge to which no one else, apart from the privileged in your circle, have access to. And that is an extraordinarily powerful theme, which is in almost every discussion you read, Foreign Affairs, the journals, or Chatham House's one, and so on. It's complicating how this intense Gnosticism pervades Western culture today. And it, you know, go back to 2,000 years and so on, the whole Gnostic. But still, that's the second feature. Closed thinking, hyper-normalization, everything else becomes deviant. And of course, I'll give another anecdote. I know I'm running out of time. But for example, I mean, I've just, in a few months, a book, a small short book of mine, be coming out, and it's called The Culture of the Second Cold War. And what prompted that was a talk I gave in Nottingham about 18 months ago, 15 months ago. And it was about 100 people attended, staff, students, postgrads, and so on at Nottingham Trent University. And we had a very good open discussion, you know, really good, lots of Q&A and so on. And it was just an open dialogue. Afterwards, I discovered that two colleagues of the staff member who invited me wrote to their vice chancellor calling for the person who invited me to be sacked. It was absolutely astonishing. And in fact, I never become angry, but it disturbed me to such a degree. That's why I'm glad to write the book. But that sort of behavior is, you know, it was vindictive, it was punitive, complete denigration of collegiality, which you should have in a university, and a complete repudiation of dialogism, which is at the very heart of any cultural in what we're doing here today. And in fact, we're in excellent discussion. There was excellent feedback from, I think, from that session in Nottingham, and therefore the matter was dropped. Really, everybody enjoyed the discussion, and I'm still in contact, and some people wrote master's theses and essays on the basis of it. It was fine. It was what should have happened. And yet the idea of doing it, and obviously I've been endlessly condemned as well for talking openly in this way. In other words, it's so frightening of where we are, this, you know, cancel culture and so on. A third feature of this Cold War where we are, and the culture prejudices, is anti-diplomacy. That dialogue and diplomacy and engagement is considered a privilege only to those who deserve it. In other words, it's anti-diplomacy because diplomacy, in my old-fashioned view, is about talking to people with whom you don't agree. It's about managing difference, but no, and that's why today diplomacy is almost completely dead, why the West is constantly attacking the institutions of diplomacy, closing diplomatic, which never happened in this way in the first Cold War. United States, Trump gave them 24 hours when he closed the Russian consulate in San Francisco to pack up all their documents and so on. And of course, then the Russians expelled US diplomats, and they're down to skeleton staff. The Belarusian embassy in London has 2 members of staff left. 2. You know, what used to be half a dozen, and the military attaché and the press officer and so on. They've all been expelled, down to 2 very nice young people, actually, very smart, But it's just an extraordinary attack on diplomacy. And that is that thinking which it's far worse than the First Cold War. Now, I've mentioned the fourth element, which is this militaristic ideology of democratism, which is so on. Ultimately, you could say it's a crisis of hegemony, leadership, conviction. Hegemony isn't the same as empire. It's a way of convincing others that what you're doing is the right thing. Today, that crisis shows itself in the lack of self-confidence of the political way, and therefore becomes more and more coercive. And I was going to add a little bit on just, on the European Union. And this is my final point. This is very much what's happened within the European Union. When I talk about European Union, I'm talking about it at two levels. There is a functionalist European Union, which I fully endorse as a committed and wholehearted European, which by functionalist, I mean transport links, I mean educational links, I mean economic and trade integration and so on. That is that functionalist vision of the European Union. In recent years, a second European Union predominates, and this is a geopolitical European Union, which is fundamentally corrosive and undermines that functionalist vision. And this is where we are. And this is what's happened within the European Union today. So there's not an anti-European Union statement now. It is that we want our vision, the Gaullist vision of a European Union as a union of nation states, the one put forward by Christopher Bickerton, my colleague, and others, the Cambridge Group, and so on. So, but what we have is a European Union Commission, basically hijacked by Ursula von der Leyen and her acolytes. It's frightening. And basically, she's now drawn on the anti-Russian, militaristic, NATO, pro-US, all the worst instincts have now gathered in the commission, and this new commission established now 2024 to 2029. It's now gathered a whole stack of people, and the commission itself has been transformed into, as Wolfgang Streeck puts it, an extended European arm of NATO and the United States. It's this transformation is, the vast literature now emerging about the way she has actually transformed that European Commission. And it's actually, she has centralized illegally powers because foreign and defense policy are not Commission competencies. They're national competencies. And when Slovakia and Hungary point this out, they're condemned, as happened to Viktor Orbán in the European Parliament the other day. It's actually frightening. I've got a whole stack of information about all of this. And this was three things which have done that, moved it towards it: the global financial crisis and its long-term effects, the pandemic, and the war in Ukraine. So, in other words, we've seen a usurpation of power, and indeed the political character has now changed. For example, Kaja Kallas has been nominated as the External Foreign Affairs Commissioner, Kubilius as defense, on and on. The East Europeans are the fundamental basis of this transformation, who are virulently anti-Russian, virulently anti-peace, virulently pro-American, virulently pro-NATO. And this is a transformation which has taken place without any democratic mandate and without any genuine discussion. So I'm sorry to end on that harsh note, but it's an important one, because we're seeing, as I say, state transformation going on as a result of these confluence of these multiple crises and these multiple historical cycles. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sakwa. We'll have some Q&A for a few minutes. Anybody wishing to take the first question?
Well, we're just picking up on the last one you read about the European Union. did mention the fact, well, you did perception that the European Union needs to stand on its own 2 feet because the states is pulling away from it and is no longer willing to fund that security umbrella for Europe. And so there's another possible interpretation that the European Union feels it needs to strengthen and centralise in order to fill that vacuum.
Thank you very much. That is an important point. Absolutely right. It is very much part of the discussion that, especially if Trump gets a second term, and so that's the, if you like, the fourth argument why this commission is now trying to develop, defense and other identity, because 2 things. If Trump is elected, then they want to move it. And in general, the United States is focusing more attention on East Asia and so on. And why should it maintain its defense and other budgetary commitments when the European Union, cannot even, it's only 23 out of 32 NATO countries today have a defense budget of over 2%, which is the NATO target. So you're absolutely right. It's the idea now is that the European Union should, as it were, take more responsibility for its security and defense, as the United States, first of all, naturally, after 70 years of the end of the Second World War, and it's got other challenges and other fish to fry, quite apart from China. So you're absolutely right. That's a way. But I mean, okay, thank you for that. Then the question then becomes, what sort of geopolitics do we want to see? And what you're saying is absolutely right. And I, as a Gaullist, would say exactly that we do want to see European Union standing on its own feet and defending its own interests. But not what has happened with Ursula von der Leyen is that this whole process has been NATOized. What I'm arguing for is a post-NATO Europe, and European security can only take place if it includes all the countries from Eastern Europe, and I'm talking about Minsk, I'm talking about Moscow, I'm talking about Kiev, I'm talking about Astana, and I'm talking about Dushanbe and Central Asia. This is that vision which I've been arguing for 40 years, that it's exactly that. Europe should stand on its feet, it should be there. Definitely, again, I stress once again, not anti-American, but post-American. We work with our friends and allies in the United States, but, and this is the key point in my view, and why I, in the past, was such a pro-European, because it was a peace project to overcome the logic of war and conflict. And the tragedy of our day is that Brussels has now become the progenitor, the generator of conflict and hate and violence. Look at the discussions in the European Parliament. It's frightening. If you take away some of the language, and so I didn't do it, but somebody did it recently, the speeches of Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister. If you close your eyes and just listen to the text, and somebody said, this is Nazi Germany. I'm sorry to be so extreme, and it wasn't me saying it, I'm quoting, but that's the sort of language we now hear as Europe stands on its feet. So what Europe and what feet and what will it be its policies? And it must be pan-continental peace project within the framework of the United Nations Charter. So thank you.
If you wouldn't mind repeating the questions so that Zoom picks up.
Okay, yes.
Just picking up your reference to Western Gnosticism, I'm sure you'd agree that there is also Eastern Gnosticism. And it is frightening that these political ideas become polarized in a world where everything else is becoming interdependent. All the functional things you referred to in Europe are now worldwide, aren't they? Education, resources, trade, the environmental problems that the world faces, and which the UN is trying to encourage people to cooperate, require us, all nations, to cooperate. And yet we've got this polarization happening, apparently for political reasons. And it seems so surprising to me that our political leaders can't see this. That the wars that we're engaged in at the moment are defeating our attempts to cooperate on mutual.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So the question, so the question basically is arguing, pointing out the contradiction between the sort of universal challenges facing humanity, and indeed the point of human development, which we've got of communications, economics, cheap flights globally, and so on. So the greater interconnectedness of the world, yet the bitter divisions at the political level becoming ever more stark. Absolutely right. You're talking about Eastern Gnosticism to begin with. You're absolutely right. It has its own dynamic and logic, if you like, its own reality, which assumes a competitive form. But leaving that to one side, but you're absolutely right. And that is why this contradiction has become even more absurd. You've mentioned one thing which you could have mentioned to add to that, perhaps even above all, that challenge facing humanity together, which is global climate change. And the fact that given the problems, and also the fact that the human ingenuity has got to a point now in which we can deal with those challenges of underdevelopment, of poverty, and so on and so forth, if only we overcame problems, this, first of all, at the global level, this sort of reversion to Cold War. It is, Cold War was catastrophic the first time. The second time, it is pointless, it is damaging, it is eminently avoidable. And you mentioned the wars. The Ukrainian war, well, it's not a topic we've got here today, but just to say, it was immediately avoidable, just like, Middle East is more intractable, and so on. But certainly the bigger one, which is in East Asia, I know that people may say that it's not so important. Well, it certainly is. China is putting out, building, basically every year, China is building a fleet bigger than the British Navy itself. The United Kingdom has only 16 surface vessels, major surface vessels left. But China's pumping out, it doesn't. So this gulf, you're absolutely right, is one. How do we get from this negative peace, which is just simply trying to avoid war, to a positive peace agenda of peace and development, which is what the United Nations and what the United Nations Association is all about? How do we get to it? Obviously, by sticking to UN Charter principles. How do we get it politically? Is, I think, that, as you say, education, talking, what we're doing, and it looks like this lady in November does the same thing as well. So it's by, first of all, analyzing where we are. So ideas matter. Ideas and concepts and conceptualizing, you've just done it. There's contradiction between the challenges facing humanity, and more than that, the technical functional development of humanity has got to this point. And yet it is constantly reverting back to a very primitive version of competition and number one and primacy and so on. The United States has to be dominant, number one, 800 bases around the world, 450 surrounding China, 450. And it didn't even have enough, so it has to have yet another one in Brisbane and in northern Queensland in Australia, if that wasn't enough. So it's easy in that context simply to blame Washington, but I certainly do. And even, just to say one other thing, so to say about this, what cheers me a lot is that in the United States, there are enormous, the great thing about the United States, it's got an enormous vitality to it still. And there's an enormous amount of peace movements, enormous amount of people who are saying exactly what we're saying. We need to move beyond this negative and in the world. And I just had a very close friend who just come from California. She was in Canterbury this week. And she runs an organization called Praxis International, Peace Movement. She was saying, about in California, which is one of the wettest, the catastrophic state of infrastructure. Bridges, railways, everything is just falling apart. The state's educational system deeply underfunded, and yet they can get to over $1 trillion on defense budgets and security budgets. And of course, every year the US budget deficit increases by $890 billion. It is now nearly $35 trillion. It is unsustainable, but that's another issue.
Can I come back to van der Leyen? I'm surprised that he put it down, or surprisingly, February as well. But when she looks round the member states and sees the coalition gridlock in Germany, ditto in France, some confusion in Holland, then you can understand why she would want to play a more dominant role. But my question is really, from what you've said, how does the somewhat gridlocked state of democracy in all the Western world, whether you've got Trump, Paris, or coalition gridlock in Germany, how is that going to play out in terms of the strength of those Western world? And is this focus on criticising Russia, China, just as a defense mechanism to take attention away from some of the internal chaos within these states?
So the question with two parts. First, a comment on Ursula von der Leyen, and the as it were, a logical response to challenges is to centralize, and the larger question about the national populist challenge in Europe itself, and relatively gridlocked governments everywhere else. My view on that, first on Ursula von der Leyen, her response, of course, exacerbates the crisis of which it's meant to be a response, in my view, and it will lead to almost certainly a major crisis in the European Union. I mean, some people are very catastrophic talking about it, but I'm not. What we do need, though, is a return more to a Gaullist union of nation states, because the last thing we needed is a Brexit-style response, which is just to cut yourself off. Which what we do, in my view, is to go back to that original vision of David Matriani. I don't know how many of you have looked at his work. David Matriani was a Romanian professor at the London School of Economics, just during the war and after, in which he wrote about a book called, an excellent book called A Working Peace System, which was about functional integration, alluding to what you're saying, a functional integration. Of course, we, Britain, with our neighbours in France and all the others, it's sensible to have easy travel, cultural exchanges, educational. We at the University of Kent used to have, a B diplôme with Institut Politique in Lille. It was quicker from us in Canterbury to get to Lille than to London before High Speed 1 was built, and so on. It just makes sense. Lots of little countries coming together functionally. He opposed this territorial framework. So the territorialization of the European Union, it should have had open-ended, and if it had been functionalist rather than geopolitical, then Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, all of these would have been integrated just naturally, instead of which they became it mimicked the nation state. And it has absorbed the negatives and not the positives of the nation. Because today, the European Union, if you look at the speeches in the European Parliament and all the statements by Ursula von der Leyen, they're full of hate. It's just unbelievable. It's full of violence. The whole language is denigrating Russia. 150 million people live there. They're Europeans, and in Belarus, 10 million. And they're called as if they're this doesn't mean to endorse their politics or endorse their domestic, not at all. But is to say there's another way of working. But your larger point about the national populist is a symptom. So the gridlock is a result in Germany. You have, well, we can go to detail, and in France, Le Pen, which of course was doing very well, and then of course got the left emerged, which dominated, won the parliamentary elections in France just recently. All of this is a crisis of the radicalized center. A few people have written about this, Tariq Ali and others, but the center is now being, if you like, Atlanticized or Cold War-ified, and so on. Keir Starmer in the UK, Macron, Scholz, all these people, none of these people and Meloni in Italy. None of these people, they're all centrists now. Meloni, even though she comes from the right and some a little bit from the left. It's the center itself is hollowed out. It's a void. There's nothing there. That's why Keir Starmer, for example, could go to Washington on the 13th of September with only one thing in mind, and that is to get permission for Ukraine to shoot long-range missiles into Russia to kill Russian civilians in Belgrade or Kursk or Voronezh and so on. He went there thinking he was going to get a promise, a statement. Of course, even then in Washington, he didn't even get a meeting with Biden. And they said, who's this crazy guy? This centrist coming there, supposed to be leftist, is talking about taking us into Third World War. Who is this crazy guy? He came back like a whipped dog on the 13th of September, empty-handed. That is an example of this crisis of centrism. He's got no idea. He's got no vision. Obviously, it would be better than some other versions, but that was an example. And that is why people vote for AfD in Germany, for Le Pen. My view is that the better view is the left challenge. And, populism is a way of expressing political views when all other channels are blocked. In Germany, we have the Sarah Wagenknecht group, which is, I think, extraordinarily done well in Thuringia and Saxony and in Brandenburg in recent federal Länder elections. And what she's saying is very important. She's a peacenik. And all these right and left populism on the whole are saying this militarism has eaten us up. It has absorbed the center. There's no center left. It's a radical center. It's a Westernist. It's an example precisely of this political West established a Cold War West, which of course we should abandon. So, your point is absolutely right. But then we have to diagnose, those are the symptoms, diagnose the illness, if you like, to use medicalization more broadly. It's a reflection. And, my view is that, it's quite likely that this Labour Party will split. There will be a split off to the left and going again to try to formulate a peace agenda. And our MP in Canterbury, as you know, Rosie Duffield, left, as you know, in rather spectacular circumstances a few weeks ago. So down in Canterbury, by the way, there's a lot of debate about all of this. It's quite lively discussions, precisely on the theme you're just saying, how could we get a sort of a politics which is tolerant, inclusive, and everything else, but filling that void, because it's ruling the void, is a void there. As I said, the Labour Party used to be a movement. It's now become a machine. And, it won the election, but then doesn't quite know what to do with it. So it's certainly gone for so long, but it's an important issue, fundamental issue even.
Just winding out a bit further, we've got nation states at the moment, but lots of driving forces which seem to be driving international political scene seem to be dominated by extreme right, whether it's the US or the oligarchs competing in the East. To what extent have they actually undermined the concept of the nation state, or is it the beginning of that? And what does that mean for something like the UN?
Yeah, thanks so much. That opens up again. So the question was about non-state actors, effectively, dominating politics. And again, this is an important issue. When I mentioned earlier about the domains of international affairs, I mentioned the international system, UN, and I mentioned international politics where great powers contest and other powers try to assert themselves. There are two other dimensions, domains, if you like, of international affairs. The third one is exactly that, international political economy. And the fourth one would be transnational civil society, things like Oxfam and Amnesty International and so on. But what we've seen is the transformation of the state, in part generated again by the militarism in the Cold War which we've never been able to shake off, is that the United States has become, this lady who was speaking to just down in California, she called it an oligarchy. And the removal in 2009, I think, by the Supreme Court, what's it called, Friends United, judgment, which removed limits on political funding. And so you put your funding through the political action committees. For example, Elon Musk has donated $75 million to Trump campaign just now. Peter Thiel, T-H-I-E-L, I don't know how many of you guys have been following his extraordinary behavior, but Peter Thiel is another one who is, great Trumpite at the moment, and he's got a strange vision, and his vision is precisely anti-state, because this is why I keep stressing the state. Many people don't like it, anarchists don't like it, but it is only within the nation state that you can have the exercise of popular sovereignty, call it democracy. What these guys don't like, these oligarchs in the US, don't like, because the state can control and limit oligarchs. That's why they, in the US, it was a Supreme Court. It wasn't the US Congress which decided that, it was a court which decided it, which is, again, an undermining of democracy. So everywhere, going back to the previous question, democracy is being eroded and undermined. So you're absolutely right. So it's, how do we get back? These guys hate the United Nations. They call it world government because, again, it's a constraint upon them. And oligarchy is, the way that capitalism has now developed. Again, this whole debate about the market relations is one form, but it's particularly degraded form of Anglo-Saxon capitalism, neoliberalism. Naomi Klein is absolutely excellent about the way the Chicago School, Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek have changed the character of capitalism. The basic picture, in my view, again, I like these long cycles. We had 30 years after 1945, which was a continuation of Rooseveltian New Deal, social democracy. We had it, Butzkellism in the United Kingdom, established a welfare state, welfareism, and so on. The last 30 years, 40 years, has been a counter cycle, a neoliberal, which has been anti-statist, which has allowed oligarchy to emerge, vast inequality to emerge, and of course, extraordinary ineffective governance. Government itself is ineffective, it cannot do anything, it cannot achieve anything. But for all sorts of reasons, this extraordinary vision of endless tax cutting, where, rather than investing in public services, which people want and need, infrastructure as well. So it's been undermined. The question today is, in my view, we're at an inflection point. That's why I talk about these various, that's another cycle within that 1945 to today cycle. I think we're at an inflection point, again, touching on the previous point. This last cycle has established a void, nothing there. There's no vision of the future. No, I remember when I was young, we used to get excited when there was talk of a new power station, a new hydroelectric dam, a new invention for India for gene tech and create the green revolution and so on. All this was exciting stuff. Development. We used to believe in development. We used to believe in local government. Could do things, positive things, make life better for people. All of that is gone, and it's part of that erosion, which is partially oligarchization of capitalism and neoliberalization, which is basically anti-statist of the worst order, anti-UN, anti-universal principles, and so on, to allow a type of global anarchy to emerge. And that is why this inflection point, why I mentioned Sarah Wagenknecht and others who are standing against it. And in fact, last week I was in Macedonia, just before Alex Salmond went there, week before last. And very interesting in Skopje, in which there was this sort of left movement beginning to emerge as well. Very articulate, very intelligent, developmental. In other words, trying to reimagine what a socialism for today would look like, or social democracy for today, because social democracy is exhausted of the Starmer sort. And how a socialism which emerges out of the needs and issues which we've been talking about today, to take advantage of the technological and other achievements of humanity, but to deal with the problems of humanity. So, of course, to learn from the catastrophic experience of socialism in the 20th century, state socialism, totalitarianism, but to move beyond it against narrow nationalism, sectarianism. I mean, in India, unfortunately, we see Hindutva, as you know, absolutely. I think that Muslims make up 250, 300 million people in India, and yet they're now being more and more marginalized. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. That, in other words, we need to look at the economic level. And just to say one final thing on this, in Canterbury, my little Canterbury, on the road down towards Margate, 70% of the children living on that road, the A28, live in poverty today, in the world's 6th largest economy. Why?
With that note, I think it might be given on. Big thanks. Those of these who belong to the master people, for those who have books and so on. Before we go this, keep off next door, don't forget your contribution, and do remember the Burns evening and the Christmas tree. Thank you very much for coming.
Say stop recording. Yes. Yeah.